This is Lesson 28.3, Developments in the Soviet Union and the East Bloc. What was the pattern of post-war development in the Soviet bloc? College Board Topic 9.4, Two superpowers emerge. Explain the economic and political consequences of the Cold War in Europe. Seen that already. Central and Eastern European nations within the Soviet bloc followed an economic model based on central planning, extensive social welfare, and specialized production among bloc members. This brought with it the restriction of individual rights and freedoms, suppression of dissent, and constraint of emigration from the various populations within the Soviet bloc. Eastern European nations were bound by their relationships with the Soviet Union, which oscillated between repression and limited reform until the collapse of communist governments in Eastern Europe and the fall of the Soviet Union. After 1956, Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev's de-Stalinization policies failed to meet their economic goals within the Soviet Union. Combined with reactions to existing limitations on individual rights, this prompted revolts in Eastern Europe, which ended with a reimposition of Soviet rule and repressive totalitarian regimes. Places: the Soviet Union, the Eastern Bloc, and Hungary. Time frame: roughly 1946 to the 1970s. Key concepts of the developments in the Soviet Union and the East Bloc: Socialist Realism, Re-Stalinization, Soviet-style communism, Illyrian-style communism, and De-Stalinization. Key people of developments in the Soviet Union and the East Bloc: Joseph Stalin, of course, Imre Nagy. I've heard 3 or 4 different ways to pronounce his name. I've heard Imre Nagy, Imre Nagy, Imre Nagy. Flip a coin, take your pick. Bottom line, as Tom Ritchie says, it's a written test. Josip Tito, Leonid Brezhnev, and Nikita Khrushchev. Introduction. In the West, European countries gained economic and political independence from the U.S. But in the East, the Soviet Union made the following more and more clear. We're not going anywhere. Neither are you. We liberated you from the Nazis and the capitalists and the Western imperialists, and that's how it's going to stay. Stalin died in 1953. His death allowed for some economic gains and freedoms, but the Eastern European countries were nevertheless going to continue to do things the Soviet way, whether they wanted to or not. So you could apply the old adage, the USSR sneezes and the Eastern Bloc catches cold. Post-war life in the Eastern Bloc. The people of Russia had endured totalitarian dictatorship and state terror before the war. Then they showed their rulers their great loyalty in the Great Patriotic War, what we call World War II. 20 million Russians were killed in that war. The Russian people really thought that Stalin and the Soviet government would show them gratitude with more democracy, with more freedoms. But according to Stalin, gratitude is a sickness suffered by dogs. Gratitude would not be on the menu. Also, Stalin was paranoid to the max. And these two concepts, ingratitude and paranoia, are not unrelated. By 1946, Stalin had already identified his next arch rival, and that was the United States. Capitalism is the enemy. There would never be lasting peace in the world as long as capitalism existed anywhere on the planet. Notice, this was an ideological argument, not cultural, ethnic, economic, nationalist, etc. Stalin's goal was the extension of communism as far as he could take it. In 1947, Stalin established Cominform, the Communist Information Bureau. It was a reaction to the Truman Doctrine. Communism was to be a worldwide paradigm. Communism wasn't supposed to consider such provincial things as ethnicity, borders, or language. Cominform replaced independent thinkers with loyal Stalinists. So Cominform was to be an instrument for controlling and coordinating communist parties all over the world from the Soviet Union, inside of the USSR, in the Eastern Bloc, and in the West. Stalin had his political foe, the U.S., and he had his ideological foe, capitalism. And it's against these two things that Stalin was going to grow and extend his power. Where did Stalin's power come from? He knew how to keep rewarding his supporters, and he knew how to get rid of those who didn't support him. The Communist Party, Stalin's party, controlled the government and the money in the government. What tools did Stalin have in his toolbox? Rigid ideological indoctrination, attacks on religion, no civil liberties, lots of prisons, forced labor camps, and places of exile for his competitors. So through Cominform, all these Eastern Bloc countries had communist parties that, number one, used the Soviet model of communism to inform themselves on how to run their countries, and number two, Soviet advice, assistance, and direction. Not all communists were alike. You may be a communist. You may be a Nazi resistance leader. You may be a war hero. You may be in charge right now. But if you were not a Stalinist, you were out. You had to join the Communist Party that did what Moscow said, or you could be arrested. You could be given a trial in which you were labeled disloyal. You could be imprisoned, and you could be executed. What is the primary goal of communism? Simple. One-party rule. Two parties, even two communist parties, are not acceptable. For example, Yugoslavia. Yugoslavia got some help from the Red Army during World War II, but they needed far less help than the other European bloc countries had needed. So the Red Army didn't have a presence in Yugoslavia. And leader Josip Tito was himself a communist. He even helped form Cominform. But by 1948, Tito decided that he couldn't create a strong, independent economy under the Soviet model. Tito split with Stalin. He said, "We are not following the Soviet model. Instead, we will follow the Illyrian model. It's less ideological, more pragmatic. Small businesses were allowed. Limited land ownership was allowed. Some competition was allowed." Stalin publicly admonished Yugoslavia for, quote, failing to admit and correct their mistakes. Yugoslavia was kicked out of Cominform for having nationalist elements. Stalin planned an invasion. He said that Tito would fall from power as soon as people found out he was kicked out of Cominform. Then an invasion would be easy and supported by the Yugoslav people. But Tito's power didn't collapse. So Stalin took another strategy. He arranged several failed assassination attempts on Tito. And Tito wrote in a letter to Stalin, "Stop sending people to kill me. We've already captured 5 of them. If you don't stop sending killers, I'll send one to Moscow, and I won't have to send a second." Yugoslavia was an exception to the rule. It was the only Eastern European country that successfully defied the Soviet Union. Another reason the Soviet Union didn't invade was because Tito was accepting some Marshall Plan money from the U.S. So what was the Soviet model that the Soviets insisted that every Eastern Bloc country follow? It consisted of such things as 5-year plans, nationalized industry, priority given to heavy industry and military, priority taken away from consumer goods and housing. Consumer goods are bad. They produce waste. They foster individualism. They foster social inequality. And collectivism of agriculture. What does the Soviet model look like at a ground level? Superhuman work quotas, low pay, poor working conditions, revolts and uprisings. Revolts and uprisings are great for the Soviet Union. Every time these happen, you can send in more troops to quash them, and you can keep them there. And then you can justify your greater military presence. Social realism and the new Communist Party. The Communist Party was a big patron of the arts. Artists of all kinds were required to make art that promoted communist propaganda. This was art that glorified the worker. If you did something other than that, you risked being denounced by the party. So what they produced was called Social Realism. Reform and De-Stalinization. In 1953, Stalin finally died. He left behind a lot of problems that he had created for his successors to deal with. The people hated and feared the government. They had to rein in the secret police. They had to close a lot of these forced labor camps. Stalin's planned economy had stalled. Something had to be done to revive it. And Stalin's anti-Western hostility had caused a strong NATO alliance. And this alliance had left the Eastern Bloc with few friends. Nikita Khrushchev took over in 1955. Khrushchev saw a great need to depart from the things that Stalin had done. He needed to gain support for himself and other reformers. In 1956, Khrushchev decided to take a big risk in order to try to win support for reform within the Communist Party. He made a secret speech at the 20th Party Congress for top-level party reps, which meant it was for Communist Party members and Communist Party members only. Khrushchev blasted Stalin. He called Stalin a criminal. He called him a cult of personality. He called him a self-aggrandizer. Called him a bungler of the war, World War II. He said that Stalin ignored due process in order to get rid of thousands and thousands of people. And he had created a culture of fear and desperation. This speech could have gone horribly wrong. For all Khrushchev knew, these communists would have torn him limb from limb right then and there for such heresy. Or they could have arrested him on the spot and had him executed. Instead, they applauded. And that was the green light that Khrushchev needed to institute reform. This speech was read aloud at local communist meetings nationwide, and support for reform began to build. Was this a grassroots, people's effort at reform? No. Regular people were kept out of the loop. This was strictly a Communist Party reform. They weren't going to share it. They called it liberalization. We in the West call it de-Stalinization. So what did this reform look like? New blood in the party. Fill the ranks with loyal reform supporters. And relaxed tensions with the West. Stalin's attitude had always been that capitalism was evil. It was a danger. It was a cancer. War against it was inevitable. The communists were eventually going to have to cut it out of the planet. Khrushchev had another idea: peaceful coexistence. What did peaceful coexistence mean for people economically? It meant, let's cut back on all this heavy industry and military spending. Let's shift to producing more consumer goods and agriculture. Things began to finally, slowly improve under Khrushchev. People began to be able to buy things like TVs and cars. What did peaceful coexistence mean for people culturally? Artistically, artists began to successfully rebel against social realism. And they didn't get shot or imprisoned. If Khrushchev criticized Stalin, why can't we criticize Stalin? So you had people like Boris Pasternak, who wrote Dr. Zhivago about how awful life was under Stalin. Foreign policy and domestic rebellion. Stalin had always believed that, according to Marxist ideology, war with the West was inevitable. Nothing and no one was going to be able to stop it. But Khrushchev departed from that and said, no, war with the West is not inevitable. It could be averted. The Allies from World War II had occupied Hitler's home country of Austria for 10 years. They didn't want the Soviet Union to threaten it, so Khrushchev promised to leave Austria alone. More importantly, Khrushchev started reaching out for allies in the decolonizing and developing world of Asia and Africa. You might think that the Eastern Bloc states would respond positively to Khrushchev's reforms. East Germany was actually opposed to them. As dedicated communists, they liked the older system better. Poland had a partial rebellion. A new communist government came to power in 1956, and these Polish communists gave more freedom to peasants and to the church. That may have gotten them in trouble except for two things. Number one, they were still committed communists, and number two, they promised to remain loyal to the Warsaw Pact. Hungary took reform much further than Poland did and got burned. They also had a popular protest that instilled a new communist government. Imre Nagy became the new prime minister in 1956. He was a liberal communist, not a Soviet-style communist. Nagy went way farther than Poland did in reform. Nagy took political change for an Eastern Bloc country to a reckless level. He went far beyond what the USSR would or even could accept. Nagy announced a multi-party democratic election. He believed the Communist Party could go toe-to-toe with any other ideology out there and win an election. So Nagy envisioned a kind of reformed communism. That had never been seen before in the entire world. At first, the Soviets were willing to try to talk Nagy down from the tree he had climbed. Communism was something you imposed on people by force. Otherwise, the bourgeoisie would come along and entice the proletariats with sweet nothings and then exploit and victimize them later. You know how they are. You didn't want to give the bourgeoisie any chance to do that with free and open elections. But then Nagy went off the deep end and did something that must be absolutely stopped, no matter what the cost. He announced that Hungary was leaving the Warsaw Pact. And if that wasn't enough, Nagy also asked the United Nations to help defend Hungary against reprisals by the Soviet Union. There was no way that the Soviet Union could accept that. So the Soviets took the plunge. Unlike Poland, which promised to stay in the Warsaw Pact, unlike Yugoslavia, where Tito was getting U.S. government money, and the Soviets didn't actually have troops in Yugoslavia, in Hungary, the Soviet Union moved tanks into the capital and cracked heads. There was bitter fighting. 2,700 Hungarians were killed. Nagy was executed in 1958 by the replacement government. Thousands of Hungarians went to prison. The crackdown paid off for the Soviet Union in 4 ways. The other Eastern Bloc countries saw that once you're in the Eastern Bloc, you're in for good. Number 2, with any reforms you might want to make to the system, you had better figure out how to do it without openly challenging Soviet control. Number 3, the entire world also saw that Soviet domination of the Eastern Bloc was there to stay. And number 4, everyone saw that the USSR was willing to do whatever was needed to defend its control of its satellite states. But there was also a negative consequence. Support for the Soviet-style communism weakened in the West. All the Western countries had communist parties. Some were quite strong and vocal. But this crackdown was very disillusioning for the idealist communist who believed that communism would produce the perfect society in which all people were truly equal and workers actually got what their labor was worth. Tens of thousands of loyal, hardworking communists simply quit and were no longer communist. Limits to reform. Khrushchev predicted that the USSR would, quote, bury the U.S. economically. He made comments like, "We will overtake the U.S. and wave bye-bye," and there's a YouTube link right there. But Khrushchev made other communists nervous. His foreign policy had much less consistent success. Khrushchev had 2 qualified successes, although we often think of these as failures for him, especially since Khrushchev completely lost power in 1964. The first qualified success was the Berlin Wall. The border between East Berlin and West Berlin had been wide open. People were leaving East Germany through West Berlin in droves, and something had to be done to stop this hemorrhaging of able-bodied East Germans. In 1958, Khrushchev's first thought was to tighten the border controls and demand that the Allies, the U.S., Britain, and France, leave West Berlin. All these former allies refused. Their response was, West Berlin is ours, we're not going anywhere. So in 1961, Khrushchev supported East Germany's idea to build a wall across the entire city from north to south. Kennedy's response was simply, we don't care how much wall you build, you can't seal off our airport within the wall. Kennedy really saw the Berlin Wall as a potential good thing. The Soviets would get it out of their system, and tensions would be decreased. So Kennedy didn't try as hard as he could have to stop it. The other qualified success that Khrushchev had was the Cuban Missile Crisis. Khrushchev didn't have much to lose in the Cuban Missile Crisis. Fidel Castro was a communist. He was an ally of the USSR. He was more than happy to let Russia build nuclear missile sites there. U-2 spy planes took pictures of the construction sites in Cuba. Kennedy confronted the USSR with photographic evidence, and Kennedy made it clear that there weren't going to be any Russian nukes 90 miles off the coast of the U.S. He blockaded Cuba with the U.S. Navy. But you don't want to call it a blockade. The word blockade sounds very warlike. Instead, you call it something clinical like quarantine. Through back-channel negotiations, Khrushchev agreed to back off and take the missiles away. But not before he got two important things. We promised not to disturb Castro's government. We had already tried to overthrow him at least once. And Khrushchev got us to promise to take our missiles out of Turkey. In 1964, Khrushchev's supporters were finally done with him. They threw their support behind Leonid Brezhnev in a bloodless coup. Leonid Brezhnev's message to the Russian people and to the Communist Party was this: Stalin wasn't all bad. Let's not be obsessed with the less than honorable things he did. Let's be informed by Stalin's good points. Khrushchev had done a de-Stalinization. You can call what Brezhnev was doing a Re-Stalinization. Brezhnev's Re-Stalinization involved the following: massive arms buildup, especially in nuclear weapons, slow down reform in the Soviet system, deal with the people with military force and harsh repression, lots of anti-Western rhetoric and threats. But there began 25 years of relative peace and stability between the East and the West.